our intention today is to work with kind of basic experiential anatomy with the intention to give us more of an experience of where these structures are in the body. And that way, when we hear instructions around yoga practices, we can have more of a kinesthetic sensation and actually feel where these structures are and how we might be able to engage them. So we're basically tonight going to cover the pelvic floor, which is the bottom, right, lower gate, or our lowest diaphragm. We're calling all of these diaphragms, and that is actually a term that's become more prevalent in the last number of years. And diaphragm actually means a partition or wall, and it comes from the Greek. And it denotes muscular fibers that run across transversely, because in the body, most of the fibers run longitudinally. So in many ways, when we can find these transverse fibers and these transverse support systems, it actually helps our verticality. I mean, that's one of the nice results of actually finding these structures that run across rather than up and down. So it really works as a wonderful way to find being in vertical. And since the practices that we're doing are centered so much on vertical posture, actually really finding the support and hopefully not finding it with a lot of tension, that we have to hold ourselves up, but that we really have this kind of built-in alignment. And the diaphragms really help with that. Besides, of course, the other ways we'll be using the diaphragms and talking about them. So tonight we're going to be looking at the pelvic floor, which we'll discuss and find the bony landmarks, and that's the bottom. Then we're going to be discussing and feeling and working with the thoracic diaphragm, which is what's called the respiratory diaphragm. And then we're also going to just touch on the vocal diaphragm, because this is actually where the breath is coming through, right? And in some ways, when we look at our pictures, we see that this almost mirrors the bottom in a certain way, right? It's an opening, right? So we have an opening from the top to the bottom. So again, my intention tonight is not to particularly relate this to yoga or to the yoga terms, although, Jules, I invite any things that pop up that, yes, that's it, please do, or connections. I really want to speak more about the basic anatomy and how we can orientate ourselves that way, how we can feel these structures, and then go from there. And my other intention is that rather than saying these diaphragms have to work a certain way, it's more that we can feel them, we can sense them, and we can find a range of movement. Because then we can feel that this movement's on a continuum, right? Because if somebody says lift the lower gate or lift the pelvic floor, if we don't really have a sense of the range, we can't even really feel what that means exactly. So that's the tack we're coming from. And as we go through, please, questions or things that you don't understand or whatever. I'll touch a little bit just, on the spine because it's central, right? And when we're working with our posture, it's really good to have a sense of just what the spine looks like, how mobile it is, how flexible, how we could take out the slack or put in the slack in terms of traction. Because when we're sitting in this, seven-pointed posture, really working with taking out the slack through the spine, really having this sense of length through the spine. And, we won't go too much in the skull today, but anyway, so that's where we're going to focus. And I did bring Organ Man because even though we're not focused on the organs, there were questions last time in the class about, well, what about the lungs? What's their role in respiration, right? And also, in the last class, I just brought the diaphragm, but I'm going to take the diaphragm out of there so you really see it. But just looking at it from here, you can see that there are organs resting on top and there are organs below. And that diaphragm is going to have a lot to do with, massaging and moving the organs up and down. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring him along today. So I think we're going to start with really finding the pelvis, because this also relates to if you're working on opening the hip joints, right, and working with this whole structure. It's really good to understand what it looks like, where the hip joints are, how you can find mobility in there. So even though we're going to relate this to the pelvic floor, it's also really great to actually experience where the hip joints are, because this ball and socket in here is what's going to give us the ability to open up the legs and sit in the lotus posture if we desire that, right? So it's very helpful, again. So what we envision, what we, it's I think what Andrew said and everybody says, you know, what you think is what you get. So the visualization we have of our own bodies is kind of the function that we get out of it. So once we can understand these structures more, we can also understand the kind of role they play and actual experience of working with these postures. So I use this guy because I can move him, and I can't move this guy. So I'm going to turn him around, though, because I want you to look at the pelvis and what it's made of. It's made of parts, right? We say pelvic bowl, but it's really made of the two ilium bones and then the sacrum, which is in the middle. The sacred sacrum. Sacrum means sacred. So it's like a sacred kind of keystone for the pelvis. So these are the famous sacroiliac joints, right? So these two halves that make up the pelvis have some mobility. They have some movement, right? So even when we're working with these postures, there's some movement in there. This is not a solid thing, right? It's important to know. And if we bring them around to the front, well, where's the other joint? The other joint's at the pubic bone, right? So these are two halves that can move. They can move together. They can move in a figure eight pattern. And actually, when we walk, there's a little bit of a figure eight that happens through there. And it's jointed at the pubic disc and at the two sacroiliac joints. The bottom, the sits bones. That's when everybody says, oh, sit on your sits bones, the sits bones. That's the bottom of the two ilium bones, right? Those are called the sitting bones. What we try to find as a reference point for finding our pelvic floor and our posture. So if you see here too, you can see how, sorry, he's missing his arm there, no problem. See how the socket of the hip joint is carved out of the ilium, right? So this is actually the socket for, so this is called the hip socket. This is the socket for the top of the femur bone, right? So this bone is going to be rotating, gliding, moving, and sliding. And if we're in the full lotus, it's going to be opening up, right? It has to rotate in that socket, right?